inviting me to speak here today. It's always really exciting to get other perspectives and feedback on research when it's ongoing. And what I'll be presenting today is some of the final years of my PhD research. So what I'm showing is very much still in progress and incomplete, but I'll be presenting is kind of the reasoning behind and the methodology and showing where looking at religious processions is going. So religion was an integral part of Roman life. It was presented in forms of public displays, but also in more nuanced forms of religion, such as temples, epigraphic, iconographic evidence. Religion was displayed usually in clearly demarcated religious areas, the most visible of which contained monumental temples. And these temples served as a focal point for Roman religion, but they also provided a larger physical context for understanding individual cults and religious practices. But understanding of these specific temples and their associated ritual activities goes beyond the temple precinct. It goes into the cityscape and the urban environment. It wasn't something that was just static, that people worshipped and only thought about religion in this one area. It's much like religion today with churches that you might have a cathedral, but you see the religious processions as they might go down the street, or you hear the church bells ringing. It permeated the larger religious and urban landscape. So that's part of what I'm interested in studying. So really this understanding of religion goes beyond looking at individual temples. So my research that I'll be presenting today is interested in how we can study this incorporation of specific cults within the ancient city beyond the temple, and doing this by looking at processions as a way of linking both the temple but the wider city. So processions were used across the Roman world, ranging from political statements of power, such as the Roman Triumph, to more nuanced displays and performance of religious spectacles. So we get examples like circus processions before gladiatorial and chariot races, but also triumphal processions like on the Arch of Titus here after winning wars, and processing through the city of Rome with all of the booty and loot, showing the Roman people what was conquered and achieved. But we also get religious processions, so the Archaeological, you have an example there. It pervaded daily life. It was a regular occurrence. But our understanding of processions and their occurrence within the urban environment is not as well understood. Focus of scholarship predominantly concentrates on trying to determine an exact processional route through the city. So here we get examples such as the Roman Triumph, that we know specific monuments associated with the Roman Triumph, such as commemorative arches. And a lot of scholarship focuses on trying to determine the exact route based on individual monuments and almost connecting the dots to determine where these routes went. But as you can see from this passage of Dio that talks about a void held down while carrying a victory in procession, such as the soldiers hold, this is more of the type of literary evidence that we get concerning processions. Yes, we get accounts dealing with the Roman Triumph or funerary processions, but more often than not, our accounts are just vague references to processional movement. So in this passage, we get some indication of the people taking part, an object that's being carried in procession, but we have no idea about which deity it's associated with, where it's occurring, what temple it's going from, where it's ending, and it's talking about a procession such as the soldiers hold. What deity is that associated with? We don't know. And that's one of the issues in trying to study processions within an archaeological perspective and determining their routes. It's just a limited amount of surviving information. More often than not, when we look at ancient cityscapes, such as at Palati Novi, we get scholars commenting on the presence of processional routes or sacred ways, usually corresponding to the major street in the city. But this is where people stop. We see a major route, we assume it's a processional way, but no further engagement with why would a procession have gone here, would it have gone anywhere else in the city, and what other factors would have impacted this route. These are pretty much discounted. In other instances, we might assume this is a processional route because there are multiple temples lining it, but this goes back to almost this idea of connecting the dots, connecting different spaces within the city and coming up with a route, but not questioning the reason or the impetus behind these routes. So one final example of looking at processions is that we get the Salutaris Decree from Ephesus. And this is a rare example of a procession in which we actually have a lot of information about. It was written it was inscribed in about 500 lines detailing when this procession would occur, all of the statues that were covered in gold that would be included in it. It goes from the temple of Artemis, up there, and then details it goes through this gate, it goes past this building, this temple, past the theater, out this gate, and then ends again at the temple. But once again, most scholarship, even concerning this route, is interested in trying to accurately determine where the route went, rather than questioning what other monuments and areas of Ephesus did it go past. Therefore, why was the processional route, and why did it move in this manner versus another? So in terms of looking at an archaeology of processions, this is pretty much how people have approached it. It's trying to determine a specific route based off of a minimal amount of surviving evidence. The past few years has seen kind of an increase in studies of looking into processions, and this corresponds to this influx of research dealing with what's termed the moving city, that the city wasn't a stagnant entity, but encompassed all daily activities as they went through. But once again, the predominant amount of research focuses on processions that we actually know a lot about. So going back to looking at the Triumph or funerary processions, which are more detailed within the literary record. Alternatively, we move to early Christianity and looking at Christian processions, which once again we know the specific churches and monuments that a lot of them went past within the city of Rome. We have yet to try to turn attention away from what we know to looking at how can we study processions, something that happened regularly throughout the year in ancient Rome in other cities. How can we approach this? One example is with a new work looking at the Roman Triumph, the architecture of the Roman Triumph. And this is beginning to try to bridge this gap by looking at the Triumph by the monuments that it encompassed and taking a more spatial approach to trying to move away and actually look at the spaces the Triumph went past. But once again, it's still trying to recreate specific routes. So how do we move from places where we know processions happened and the areas they went past to taking it into another city? And that's what I'm trying to do. And my research focuses on the site of Ostia Antica. And as we've heard previously, it's Rome's ancient port, located about 25 kilometers southwest of Rome. It has a long period of occupation. Literary sources put it around the 7th century BC, but archaeological evidence places it around the 4th century BC, and it was in existence up through late antiquity. It became increasingly important beginning in the 1st century BC when it really rose up in commercial importance, allowing food supplies to be brought to Ostia and then shipped up to Rome. And then with the establishment of Portus just a couple kilometers north, it maintained this importance. And when we're looking at the site, a lot of research is focused on kind of the commercial landscape, so looking at the massive grain warehouses that are in existence throughout the city, but also Ostia's domestic life, so it has some of the first multi-story apartments. But in combination with it, Ostia also had a very rich religious landscape with lots of different temples and deities worshipped in it. And so the degree in which the city is excavated in combination with its existing religious landscape and evidence that we have makes it an interesting site to try to look at how can we study processions that we know likely happened within this city, and moving studies away from Rome and trying to develop a methodology and a way that we can look at this. So some of the questions that I'm considering relating to processions in Ostia is, to what extent can we even study processions at a site such as Ostia? What is the best methodology for modeling and visualizing these processions? And then how do these models help us to understand Ostia's larger religious landscape? So in looking at Ostia, you can see just an overview of some of the religious areas that are spread throughout the city. And any understanding of Ostian religion is equally tied up with how the site has been excavated. Ostia has a long history of excavation, but it was predominantly excavated between the 19th and 20th century. But this is also problematic. The majority of excavations were instigated under Mussolini in preparation for Rome's World Fair that never happened because of World War II. But at this point, about 2/3 of the city were uncovered. So it was a massive earth-moving operation. You can see just some of the images. And the focus was on uncovering as many buildings as possible, retrieving statuary, inscriptions, but no detail excavation into what were the functions of these buildings and close attention to finds. A lot of the emphasis was placed on both remodeling structures to allow better access for the general public coming to visit Ostia, but also to aid in their interpretation. So a lot of Ostia was actually kind of remodeled, trying to make it appear almost like Pompeii, a traditional Roman city, as you will, to enable people to understand it. And when we're trying to look at Ostian religion, we have to keep this in mind. Most of the temples that were excavated during this time, a lot of them we don't know what deity they're associated with. This goes back to, it was excavated, but they didn't keep or retain any of the finds that could give us an identity of the cults worshipped in these areas or other ritual practices that occurred within it. These issues have shaped a lot of the ways in which Ostian religion has been approached. Early scholarship was very much focused on trying to recreate understanding what deities were worshipped in Ostia and what temples existed there. So we get early, almost catalogs of Ostia's religious environment with Lily Ross Taylor. And this is just it's a catalog of every deity known based off of epigraphic evidence and tying it a bit into the existing temple architecture. And other instances is trying to define what deity was associated with a specific temple when we don't know otherwise. If we don't have any surviving statuary or inscriptions saying this temple was dedicated to this god, there's a lot of kind of interpretation and arguments about how we can define certain temples, which makes studying Ostian religion one of the most contentious parts of the city. In terms of looking at processions in Ostia, what do we actually know? Unfortunately, not a lot. We have no surviving literary evidence detailing specific processions. Therefore, we have to rely on archaeological material and also more comparative studies to try to determine what type of processions would have even taken place at the city. So we have a couple wall paintings that depict potential processions that might have occurred. At the top here we have the Navigium Isidis, and this is associated with the cult of Isis and would have entailed the launching of a ritual ship to commemorate the opening of the sailing season. And in the painting here we see a ship that's just been launched and two figures carrying a cart back from where the ship would have been launched. We know that Ostia had a strong cult of Isis presence, but unfortunately we don't know where the temple is located. It hasn't been discovered or rightly interpreted or identified yet. So we know that this type of procession likely occurred, And this is one of the processions that we actually know in the most detail because of Apuleius' Metamorphosis that describes in detail some of the different aspects. Even though it's a fictional account, it does give us some insight into the ritual features associated with this cult. Alternatively, we have another painting that depicts on the left the Feast of Diana and a procession on the right associated with Vendemmia. This is the festival of grapes at the harvest for making wine. But in terms of both of these wall paintings, they were actually probably part of a larger calendar depicting the different months. So we can't take this as concrete proof of these types of processions for sure happened at Ostia because it was a larger kind of iconographic depiction of the months. But what it does tell us are some of the ritual components associated with festivals that would have occurred during these times. Taking this further, how can we apply this to looking at what happened at Ostia? To do that, we need to go back to what temples are there that we have firmly identified. So one example is the campus of Magna Mater that we know about, and it has several different associated deity temples within it, and there were multiple different processions associated with it. So it's moving using kind of comparative evidence for looking at what types of processions and cults existed at Ostia, and therefore what types of processions likely occurred there. But it's tying it very closely into the archaeological record of what we know. So I'm not going to try to recreate a procession to Isis because we don't have the temple, so I don't know where it started. We know it ended at the harbor, but without a start point, it doesn't really make sense to try to identify where the processional route within the city without the existing temple. So we do have to rely and focus on what we know. In terms of looking at processional scholarship at Ostia, this has only been preliminarily addressed. We have Janet Spillane analysis of a supposed sacred, archaic sacred route. And this, once again, is going back to this approach of connecting different areas because they line up and creating a route. So she's created a route that begins at the Lavinium, goes past the Sanctuary of Magna Mater, and then past the Sanctuary of Hercules, ending at the Sanctuary Castor and Pollux up the river harbor. And so this likely could have been a processional route, but the scholarship doesn't go beyond this to say what other factors and how did this ritual route impact Ostia beyond the exact route in terms of what rituals actually would have been occurring on it. Alternatively, scholars look at the Decumanus, which you can see going past the theater at the top. People comment on this was like the Decumanus, which is one of Ostia's main streets, was likely served as a processional route. But once again, commentary stops there in terms of it. It doesn't, did a procession only go along this one street? Did it go back and forth multiple times? Or is that just one segment of where the route might have gone? These are some of the questions, and this is where I'm trying to push questioning processional routes at Ostia to going beyond what we can assume to looking at different ways of considering how can we determine where routes went, and based off of where these went, how does that give us insight into the ways people interacted with religion on a daily basis. In order to do this, we need to look at urban movements. Since processions are tied up with moving through the city based on streets, this provides a bit of a starting point. But most of the research concerning urban movement has come out of studies at Pompeii, and this is focused on looking at examples of proxy evidence for movement. So how can we study where movement happened? Well, we can look at things like wheel ruts, blockades, arches, things that indicate movement or constrict movement. But unfortunately, this doesn't necessarily apply to processional routes because they were ephemeral events, primarily held in the memories of those that attended or saw them. They weren't recorded physically within the archaeological record, apart from the existence of monumental arches or temples. But it's not every time a procession happens, one of these monuments isn't created. So it doesn't really help us in determining where these routes would have gone. in terms of looking at approaches to movement at Ostia, there's been a bit of work using space syntax analysis. And this was a method developed in the 1980s by Hiller and Hansen as an architectural approach to looking at how people would have used and the impact of buildings within the modern city. So where pedestrians likely would have moved, and if you have a higher concentration of movement around one area, that might be where you want to build your shop. Similar applications can be applied to antiquity. So here what Hannah Stover has done is created an axle graph. And this is a representation of Ostia's street network, and it's looking at what are the most integrated streets within the entire city. And this is done by creating lines corresponding to the street that are the longest straight line possible, or the longest distance in which you can see, and that becomes one line. And that's then computed for all of the streets within the network. And then it shows you the relative integration. So red indicating that it's the highest integrated, and then it goes to yellow, green, blue, and then purple being the least integrated. So it gives us a bit of an indication of what are Ostia's primary and secondary streets. And as expected, the red corresponds to the Decumanus. Okay, so yes, it is one of Ostia's main streets. We kind of assume that, it's proven there. But that doesn't then help tell us where procession might have gone. An alternative approach is taken by Alan Kaiser using a different space syntax technique called street depth. And this is computed by taking a point, he takes it from the entrance gate here, and in relation to that entrance gate, how many turns does it take to reach each individual street in Ostia? So this provides another indication of the degree of integration of all these streets in relation to this one point here. So 1 being the highest integration, and then 5 here being the lowest integration because you have X number of turns to reach that street. But once again, it doesn't help tell us where processional movement went. It gives us an indication of Ostia's major streets, but it doesn't take into account other factors that affected processions or the people or the buildings in existence at Ostia during this time. So it's looking at movement in it's very much an abstract way, devoid of any of the social context. And for looking at processions, we need to move beyond this and develop a new approach. And this quote by Graf kind of highlights some of the issues that need to be taken into account with processions, where he says a procession is not just a journey from A to B. It matters where A and B are located and who is doing the journey. We have to put it in the context of what cult is the procession associated with, where is this procession occurring, so the urban context. And to be able to elicit what the purpose of a procession is, one must consider not only the form, but the total ritual context to which it belongs. So we need to take all of these different aspects and try to combine them together to move our methodology forward beyond just looking at where can movement have happened, what cults had processional activity, and try to then determine how can we study these roots. To do this, what I started is questioning what actually affects a procession's route. And these are just a few of the aspects that I've highlighted today. So first and foremost, movement potential along streets. Streets are the venue for which processions occurred, so that's a deciding factor of where they actually went, is based on the streets of a city. Urban activity. This is daily activity, the people going about life within Ostia, and how does this affect a procession? If you have a market happening, that's probably going to affect the processional route if it's carrying into the streets and creating almost a blockade. Visibility. A procession was meant to be seen. If it wasn't, it would just occur within the temple precinct. No, you might hear it, but you wouldn't see it. But by definition, a procession was a spectacle, minor or major depending on the scale, but it encompassed not only the movement, but sound, sights with colorful costumes, animals, all of these factored in and would have made an impact on people whether or not they were involved in a specific procession. If they were just going about their normal daily life, walking down the street and a procession passes, they're going to see it and know something's happening. Another factor are the people. So this is both the participants in the procession, but also those that are watching. Bystanders, whether or not they're actually participants of the cult, will be impacted. And finally, crowds. This goes to where could a procession actually have gone? Would it have actually gone down the Decumanus, Ostia's main street? Or would it have gone more down smaller side streets, avoiding the congestion of cart traffic and regular port activity that was happening in the city? Furthermore, if there are a lot of people, how could the procession have feasibly been able to move down the street if there's X number of people on a narrow street constricting traffic flow? These are some of the ideas of looking at what actually affects where a procession went. And what I'll be focusing on today are the first two, of looking at how we can determine movement potential along streets and how urban activity actually potentially affects this movement. In order to do this, I'll be applying network analysis at a pretty basic level. But network analysis comes from graph theory, and it's simply put, it's a combination of nodes. So this could be anything. This can be your friend group. This can be cities on a map. It can be the number of people in this room. And then the edges are the connections between these nodes. And network analysis presents a way to visualize and interrogate data to see what patterns actually arise. In terms of its application within archaeology, it's starting to become kind of a standard approach people are taking, but in terms of movement, it's most often applied to looking at transport routes within the ancient Mediterranean. So here we have just an example of a network that's looking at various itineraries and the cities associated with these itineraries that are put into a network graph that you can see on the bottom, and then that's super transposed onto a GIS-based map. But all of this analysis is actually carried out in another platform, not within GIS. And it's not tailored to looking at actual distances between nodes and points, so cities and the routes. But in terms of trying to use it within Ostia, I'm interested in how can we apply network analysis to determine movement potential, areas where a procession might have gone based on urban activity. So in terms of looking at pedestrian movement, what's been done previously, in GIS we get just basic route solvers. So you have point A and you have point B. What's the quickest route to get to that? But that's not adequate for looking at processional movement because the procession didn't necessarily want to take the quickest route. There are other factors involved, such as needing to pass a certain temple or avoid other areas, or actually take as long as possible so it had the greatest visibility. Furthermore, as I've mentioned previously with space syntax, it tells us relative street integration, but once again, it doesn't tell us potential routes when associated with a specific type of movement, such as processions. So in order to apply space network analysis, the first thing I had to do was actually construct a model. And this was done by digitizing all of Ostia based off of the Lanter di Ostia Antica and the Scavi di Ostia plans, because there's no uniform digitized plan that scholars use working on Ostia. Most of research is concentrated on small either buildings or neighborhoods, but not the whole city. So I had to actually digitize this plan. Second, because I'm looking at processions which are tied to the street network, I then need to have a very close temporal time frame that I'm analyzing. Ostia, as we can see here, represents the entirety of its existence from about the 4th century BC through late antiquity. There was a lot of different building activity that occurred. streets changed, streets disappeared. So I've chosen to look at the late 2nd century BC, about 180 to 190 AD, because this is one of the most well-documented periods within Ostia's history in terms of its street network, but also buildings and their uses during this time. Then moving on to looking at how do we define urban activity. I've broken this up into 4 basic categories just as a way to apply some type of analysis. It's a very simplified approach, but it has its difficulties nonetheless. So I've broken it up into looking at religious, commercial, social, and domestic. But within each of these categories, there's a lot of subcategories, and each building will oftentimes have up to 3 of these different identifications. So it's almost you might have shops at the front, and then you might have a social purpose still on the main floor, but then up above you'd have apartments. So that's 3 different activities happening within just one building. So trying to account for those becomes a bit problematic. In terms of looking at religious spaces, I've broken it up just looking here at monumental temples. Ostia has over 100 different religious areas, but this also includes domestic dwellings and shrines within the house that I have not accounted for, because processions would have gone past the monumental temples. They wouldn't have been going into domestic dwellings, so those are left out of my analysis for the moment. In terms of commercial spaces, this corresponds to the grain warehouses, but also shops, markets, and here you can see just an indication of where they're located throughout the city. Looking at social spaces, I'm defining this as places where people would have gathered. So you might get the theater or public fountains on the street, porticos. These are all defined as social, so looking at where people might have been congregating and therefore affecting processions, either crowds or for some other purpose. And then finally looking at domestic structures. So here you can see both insula apartments, so medium apartments, and the upper class domus. The next step was actually to create a network construction. So nodes in my analysis are being classified as these individual building classifications, and then the edges, the lines that are connecting them, correspond to the actual street network. So here you can see an example of what the network actually looks like once it's constructed. That the buildings that you saw previously disappear, that now all that's being taken into account within the analysis are the points that are along the digitized lines corresponding to the streets. And then what I'm applying is a Betweenness Centrality measurement. This is looking at, you have a series of nodes, as you can see in the bottom here, and basically the shortest number of paths going through any one vertex. So you have here, it's calculating all of the paths that are going through this one node here, and then it calculates it for all the paths going between these two, and then the calculation divides, and you end up with a graph that looks like this, without going into too many of the technicalities and equations associated with it. But what this means is that the higher betweenness means that it has a higher importance within the overall network, which means it has a greater betweenness. And in terms of looking at movement within the city, when applying it to nodes on a street network graph, it's the idea, the probability of movement going between any one point on the street network. And this then relates to, is there movement potential for going past this node versus another? So when looking at Ostia, if I've digitized all of the streets, what's all of the streets and all of the shops, what shops have a higher betweenness and therefore are more likely to be passed in comparison to all other shops within the city? So this then gives us a basis for looking at movement potential areas of high movement potential within the city. And Betweenness Centrality is also very useful for looking at high areas of traffic and bottlenecks within the city. It's used often in urban planning of looking at where you might need to change street networks and kind of intersections because too many people are congregating in this one area and you need to ease the flow. So it is a way of looking at movement and traffic within a street network system. In order to do this, I'm trying to calculate it within GIS. Predominantly, network analysis is performed in another platform. It's not easily integrated with GIS. So most analyses, you would take all of the data, compute it in something else, and then try to integrate the data back into GIS to then give you a map in which to overlay your results and be able to visualize how they're related to whatever urban landscape you're dealing with. But since I'm interested in processions and movement, streets and their geometry is extremely important. So I'm using the Urban Network Analysis Toolbox as a way to integrate and calculate not only Betweenness Centrality, but it takes into account actually the distance and the lengths of the streets within the calculations. So it goes beyond just creating dots and lines and something else, but actually relates it to Ostia's actual urban landscape. So here we can see an example of Betweenness calculated for all the religious spaces. And here you can see what's circled are areas of high betweenness. But just doing it on the excavated street network is a bit problematic because we get something called an edge effect. This is a bias in the data because I'm creating almost an arbitrary edge of all of these streets. But this is just what's been excavated. This isn't only where the streets went. A lot of the issues in applying Betweenness are trying to do such a calculation, but ignoring the larger geometry of the whole city. So in order to try to negate this, I've incorporated a bit of Ostia's extended street network. This is problematic because while all of this has been geophysically surveyed, it hasn't been published yet. So this is just preliminary data that I'm using and trying as a way to try to kind of counteract the edge effect that I get with the normal calculations. So here you can see the larger street network and the excavated city in blue. So in redoing the calculation of religious betweenness, you can see that once again the red nodes indicate the highest, and then it goes to orange to yellow to light green and then dark green. There's not a significant difference from the previous results, but these two areas did change in their betweenness values, so it does show that applying the larger street network does make a bit of an impact in the data. I'm going just quickly through the other spaces. We can see some of the results associated with commercial spaces. As expected, they do correspond to Ostia's major streets, but as they are commercial shops, warehouses, that is kind of to be expected. In terms of domestic betweenness, they actually pretty much avoid the major streets and they go up into some of the subsidiary ones, which also isn't too surprising. You often do not see large populations of domestic houses on major streets. They tend to be off to the side. And in terms of social betweenness, once again, it's conforming more to some of the major streets, but we are getting higher movement potential nodes in other areas. Moving beyond this in another way to try to visualize these areas of movement potential is applying kernel density analysis. And this, on the top left here, you can see just kernel density of all of the shops. This is the relative density of any entity that you define within GIS. So it as you can see here with the shops, it shows that there seems to be a high density almost everywhere in Ostia. But then when applied to the betweenness measurements, it actually starts to highlight some of the areas. that have higher betweenness that aren't necessarily as easily visible when looking just at the betweenness results of a couple slides previously. It starts to show some of the areas. So we can see, but you can see there's a high betweenness here, but it's also going up into some of those other streets. The next step is not just looking at individual areas, but starting to combine different spaces. People probably wouldn't have just chosen to go past only religious spaces. They would be thinking about other things. So this is just an example to show how this can be done. So here I have an example showing a combination of social and domestic spaces, both unweighted, but you can see some of the measurements and that they actually, it's a bit different than the just single calculations associated with those spaces. But we can also weight these results. So in this, I've weighted social as more important than domestic. So therefore, areas, it does change the results slightly. You can see here that some of the betweenness measurements have changed. It's gone up higher. So now, if you're taking social spaces as being more important, suddenly that area has a higher movement through potential. We can also take this further to combine all of the space classifications within Ostia. So here you can just see all of the nodes from all of the spaces I've defined, and a lot of these actually are stacked. So you might have three nodes for the same building relating to their different definition of space. And then with different weights, here I have religious spaces weighted as the least important and commercial the most. And you can see kind of how it's scattered throughout and how our idea of important areas and areas where you might have had movement associated with these spaces could correspond. And just to give an example, I've reversed the weighting, and here you can see it's quite similar, but there are some differences. So especially within the center here, we have nodes that have changed, and they've also changed going up into some of the side streets as well. Once again, the KDE kernel density analysis provides another way of visualizing these differences, but as we can see at the moment, the two weights actually look almost identical in these graphs. But it does make it makes it an easier way to actually see what similarities or differences are within the betweenness measurements, opposed to trying to pinpoint, oh, I think there's a larger red node there versus this other weighted graph. So it provides another visualization technique. Now, going forward and trying to define and determine specific routes, the next step I'll be doing is actually cost-distance analysis. It'll be taking all of these various betweenness measurements, areas of movement potential, and creating them as the entities for actually conducting cost-distance analysis. So what are the potential routes going based off of these different weights would it have gone, and going through all of the different iterations possible. Ideally, I'm hoping that certain routes will materialize as being more probable than not. And then we have to go from there to actually looking at, going back to the archaeological record and looking at, could a procession have feasibly gone past these streets? This is going back to how the site's been excavated. The streets were completely excavated through, and then all of the stones were replaced as we see them today. So it's going into archives and corresponding to the archaeological record to try to see, is it possible that movement would have gone this way, bringing in case studies of specific temples. So one of them is looking at the temple of Serapis, which is located right here, actually here, and integrating what are some of the parameters of the cult. And was it a citywide procession, or would it have been confined to a specific neighborhood? And then taking these betweenness measurements and this cost distance analysis and kind of defining it for what cult I'm associating it with. But in the meantime, just some brief preliminary conclusions. We can see that Betweenness Centrality tells us quite a bit more than just the traditional space syntax methods of where movement could happen. So we can see that while in the traditional one you have the main streets, here we're seeing movement potential going up a lot of the side streets. And it's showing areas where we wouldn't necessarily have thought movement was possible. But this also raises different questions of not only what impacted movement, but we can also apply it to other social activities or times of year and try to take a closer look at actually how can we study movement within the ancient city in relation to a specific intention behind that movement, opposed to just looking at movement potential more generally of what streets would people have gone through, but why would they have been going down these streets, what buildings would they have been passing, what other factors would have influenced this movement. So in this way, I'm trying to take a new approach to looking at how we can study religious processions by looking at what factors influence their movement and how this then gives us a better understanding of how religion permeated Ostia as a whole beyond being confined at a specific temple precinct. Oh, thank you.